everyone, I'm Ghadi Francis and this is the West Asia Post, our weekly show where we bring you all the latest updates from the world's most volatile region. For years, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad has been an international pariah. With the beginning of the Syrian civil war, it looked like the end was near for the leader. But now, 10 years later, Bashar al-Assad is making a comeback to the world. More and more Arab nations are normalizing ties with Syria, despite the US opposition to his rule. We tell you more. In 1992, Bashar al-Assad moved to London. He was the son of then Syrian President Hafiz al-Assad, but had very little political aspirations. Instead, his brother Basil al-Assad was being groomed, but fate had other things in mind. A brutal car crash killed the dynamic prince, turning his brother's life upside down. Bashar al-Assad was transformed overnight, from being an obscure London eye doctor to the heir apparent of Syria, taking on a crown that was never his, one that sealed the future of Syria. In his first few years as Syria's president, Assad promised a shift from his father's iron grip. He seemed to adopt several liberal reforms, offering space to his opponents and overtures to Western foes, a period painted as the Damascus Spring. But things turned sour soon as protests erupted against his rule. Reforms were swiftly buried. The focus was on the growing fire of revolution, the Arab Spring that was engulfing all of West Asia. Since then, a civil war has killed thousands, displacing millions in the country. Bashar al-Assad became an outcast. He had no friends in the Arab world. He was presiding over a broken state, stuck largely alone in his presidential palace. His Arab allies had abandoned him. He was charged with war crimes and was dependent on his only ally, Russia. But a decade later, the din of the war has receded. The region has grown tired of the conflict, thus leading to the emergence of an unlikely dynamic. International pariah Bashar al-Assad is now in demand. It started with Jordan. The two were on opposite sides in the Syrian war. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad allied with Russia, while Jordanian King Abdullah II sided with the United States. Damascus had previously accused Jordan of training rebel fighters and allowing them to enter Syria through its border. Relations between the two countries degraded to the point where Jordan kicked Syrian ambassador Bahjat Suleiman out of the country in 2014. But now, the Hashemite kingdom is reevaluating those ties. Jordan's King Abdullah spoke to Assad this month, the first phone call between the two in almost a decade. Amman fully reopened its main border crossing with Syria in a boost for their struggling economies hit by the pandemic. While the US says it opposes any normalization with Syria, a plan of its own could contribute to Assad's resurgence. Egyptian natural gas is being piped to Lebanon. This will be via Jordan and Syria, under a plan agreed by the four governments. A proposal that gives Bashar al-Assad a direct stake in finding a solution for Lebanon. And while the winds of change were already blowing, the United Arab Emirates wasn't gonna be left behind. Crown Prince Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan dialed Assad, discussing developments in Syria and all of West Asia. Nahyan's call is a part of the bigger Arab world push to reintegrate a country they have shunned during its decade-long civil war. The Arab League is also widely expected to reinstate Assad's membership shortly. For many, this portrays Assad as the Pyrrhic victor of the war. But in reality, the normalization indicates that the desire for regional stability is almost bigger than concerns over his leadership. This has to do with Syria's historical role in the region and the modern state that was created by Assad's father. But while Syrian president is back in the fold, no normalization can wipe off the last decade of destruction. While many are calling this the return of the lion, others say that Assad is ruling over mere rubble. West Asia Bureau, WION, World is One. From Beirut to Baghdad, we have a lot more lined up for today. But first, as usual, let's take a look at what else is making the headlines across West Asia.
Iran kicked off an annual Air Force drill across the country, with bombers, jet fighters and attack and surveillance drones. According to reports, all Iranian military air bases were participating in the maneuver. Saudi Foreign Minister Prince Faisal bin Farhan al-Assad and U.S. Special Envoy for Iran Robert Malley met in Riyadh to discuss the Iran nuclear talks. Washington says it is ready to consider all options if Iran is unwilling to return to the 2015 deal. More than 10,000 children in Yemen have been killed or injured in the war, according to UNICEF. At least 4 in 5 children in the war-torn nation currently require humanitarian assistance. According to a report, over 9,000 olive trees have been destroyed in the West Bank since August 2020. As olive harvest season sets in Palestine, a 10-day campaign has been launched to protect farmers from settler attacks in the region. The Turkish lira tumbled to a record low after the central bank cut its key interest rate. The lira has lost 20% of its value this year, with no immediate relief in sight amid soaring inflation.
Protesters in Iraq are calling for an election recount in Baghdad. Thousands of al-Hashd al-Sha'bi supporters protested against fraud, chanting slogans against the United States and the normalization of ties with Israel. Let's take a look.
Iraq's elections came with a lot of challenges. An economy battered by years of conflict, a crumbling infrastructure, failing state institutions, and the coronavirus pandemic. Iraq is emerging out of 2 decades of war. It has experienced insurgency since the US-led invasion toppled dictator Saddam Hussein. This was followed by a brutal war to fight off the Islamic State. It ended in 2017, but was followed by years of corruption and conflict. In the last 2 years, protests against the ruling elite have rocked the war-torn nation, killing hundreds. The polls were initially scheduled for 2022. They were earlier moved forward to June this year, but later postponed to October. The early polls were a concession to the anti-government protests, but citizens have little hope for any change.
I don't think there is hope for change in Iraq. As long as there are parties affiliated with other countries that rule us, Iraq will remain as it is.
Shiite cleric Muqtada al-Sadr has claimed victory, with former Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki close behind. But pro-Iranian groups have denounced the results as a sham. Hundreds of supporters of Iraq's powerful Hashd al-Shabi protested against what they called a fraud election. According to preliminary results, the alliance won around 15 seats. In the last parliament, it held 48 seats.
We hereby demand a recount in all the polling stations where the results were subject to appeals and complaints, as well as that the Electoral Commission responds to our calls, and for the United Nations to cooperate on this matter to assist in maintaining the democratic process in Iraq.
Hashd supporters have organized protests across Iraq. They burned tires, blocking roads around Baghdad. Hashd leaders say they will appeal ahead of a final tally expected in the next few weeks. However, the Hashd is still expected to carry weight in the parliament through the co-optation of independent candidates. The Iraq elections come at a time when the nation is more fractured than ever before. This vote's aftermath will set the tone for the coming years. Will the country usher in a new ruling class? Or will the same political groups wield power in the war-torn nation? West Asia Bureau, WION, World is One.
Lebanon has preponed the parliamentary elections to March next year. The upcoming elections will be the country's first after 2019 anti-government protests, when hundreds of thousands of Lebanese protested, calling for change. Meanwhile, the country remains on edge after what was its worst violence in years. We tell you more.
Beirut was once known as the jewel of the Mediterranean. It was once the hub of economic, social, intellectual and cultural life in West Asia. But now it is a city of baffling contradictions. Battered by one crisis after another. Lebanon is reeling from its worst internal violence in years. 7 people killed, bullets bouncing off buildings. Ambulance sirens echoing across Beirut. The same groups, the same neighborhoods. Reviving the ghost of Lebanon's 1975 civil war. Hezbollah says the Beirut violence is a dangerous development. They have blamed the Christian Lebanese forces, repeating accusations that they killed the protesters. Nasrallah even tried to showcase Hezbollah's power. He stressed that the group had 100,000 fighters, but said they were recruited to defend Lebanon from external enemies.
عم بحكيك بس باللبنانيين اللي هن لبنانيين منذ أكثر من 100 سنة.
I'm talking only about Lebanese citizens who are Lebanese since over 100 years, not only 10. Trained, organized, armed, and they have experience. And they can move mountains if they were asked. Take note, 100,000 fighters.
The Lebanese Christian Forces Party did not back down. The group's leader denied any involvement in the violence, hitting back at the Hezbollah leader's claims.
If Hezbollah wants to remove Probe Judge Bashar by force, one way or the other, what will our response be? We took a decision at the Strong Republic Coalition the night before the clashes. that the best way to confront them is to call a general closing strike.
This comes as Lebanon is going to polls next year. The plan is to hold legislative elections on March 27th. This gives Prime Minister Najib Mikati's government only a few months to try to secure an IMF recovery plan. Lebanon has been calling for an overhaul ever since the protesters rocked the country in 2019. The elections are an opportunity to vote out the old guard, but many say that the political parties will do anything they can to hold on to power. Even postpone the polls in the crisis-hit nation. West Asia Bureau, WION, World is One.
India's External Affairs Minister has wrapped up his visit to Israel. The visit highlighted key diplomatic ties. But the main focus was a Quad meet between the US, Israel, India and the UAE. Some are calling it the West Asian Quad. In our next report, we take a look at what this Quad means for the region.
India and Israel have traditionally enjoyed close ties. While India recognized the Jewish state way back in 1950, it established full diplomatic relations in 1992. Since then, the ties between the two have been growing. A latest visit by the Indian Foreign Minister helped bolster these relations further. On the agenda were a lot of bilaterals, cultural engagements and a Quad meet that has taken the region by storm. S. Jaishankar met with the new Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, his Israeli counterpart Yair Lapid, and Israeli President Isaac Herzog. Discussions included strengthening the strategic alliance, further expanding bilateral ties, and deepening the warm friendship.
Expanding the relationship in all fields.
Jaishankar's visit also marked Israel's accession to the ISA. The ISA is the International Solar Alliance, which is based out of India's Gurugram. The alliance has 124 countries as its members and aims to harness solar energy to reduce dependency on fossil fuels. Joining the alliance will allow Israel to contribute its knowledge and experience on solar power to the organization.
Let me say what a great pleasure it is to see Israel joining the International Solar Alliance. I think you bring a lot of value to the table, and as we approach COP26, it's very important that in our growing agenda, green growth, green economy is given its due place.
But a key focus of the visit was a Quad meet. Jaishankar sat down for a virtual meeting with his counterparts from US, Israel and the UAE. In attendance were Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and the UAE's Foreign Minister Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed Al Nahyan. The four leaders launched a new Quad Economic Forum. There will be more focus on infrastructure, transport and maritime security. And lastly, an in-person meeting of all foreign ministers at the Dubai Expo.
We already had a very good meeting discussing various issues and challenges that we have. India is one of our most, not only strategic partners, but lawful friends. These are ancient communities with a tendency to move towards modernity as fast as we can.
But it isn't just diplomatic ties that were explored. Jaishankar's visit also focused on India-Israel's shared history. The foreign minister laid a wreath at the military cemetery in Jerusalem. He unveiled the Boudan Grove plaque at the Jerusalem forest. and also visited the innovative kibbutz farm in Israel. A plaque unveiling ceremony in Ra'anana also highlighted the cultural relations between Tel Aviv and New Delhi. It honored Indian soldiers who fought in the First World War. This is a step towards establishing an India Trail, marking the major points where Indian soldiers fought. It is envisaged that the trail will involve 6 plaques at 6 places, of which Haifa and Ra'anana are a part of the trail. It is estimated to be completed in 2022. In an exclusive conversation to WION, the foreign minister says that he hopes that his visit will help the world understand the shared history.
This is a very special function because, as I said, I would like I'd like Indians, Israelis and the world to actually understand the shared history much better. I think today is a very good contribution to that, and I hope that as the trail gets built and people get to know this in India, and I'm sure your channel will help them to get to know it, I hope the city of Ra'anana will see more Indians.
Jaishankar's visit to Israel was crucial on several accounts, including key diplomatic events and bilateral engagements. However, the one thing that stood out during this trip was the engagement on the lesser-known aspects of India-Israel ties.
The visits to the cemetery for India's fallen soldiers and Boudin Grove, as well as the visit to the innovative kibbutz farm, sum up the focus of this trip, marking the history of the two nations and pointing the way to even greater cooperation going forward. This is Jodie Cohen from Kibbutz Be'erot Yitzhak, Israel, for WION World is One.
West Asia is not without its share of beauty, culture and oddities. In our next segment called Curiosities, we bring you some heartwarming stories from the region. That's all we have for you on this episode of the West Asia Post. I will see you next week with a brand new lineup, bringing you more stories from the world's most volatile region. Until then, stay safe. I am Ghadi Francis, and you're watching WION World is One.